Welcome to Cultural Conversations with the Mississippi State University Libraries. I'm your host, Fred Smith, and my guest today is Dr. Lucius Luke Lampton. Dr. Lampton has the Magnolia Clinic in Magnolia, Mississippi, which is down in Pike County. He's also the editor of the Magnolia Gazette and the Hinds County Gazette and multiple other things. But he is, from years of collecting books and everything, he is a true bibliophile. And today we're going to talk about something that's close to home. The Mitchell Memorial Library is the host and home of the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. And one of the most important parts of Grant's life, right at the very end of his life, was his memoirs. And Dr. Lampton is a collector of Mark Twain material, and today he's going to tell us a good bit about the connection between Mark Twain and Ulysses S. Grant. Why don't you give us a little history?
Well, the memoirs are considered one of the most important pieces of literature in America. Certainly, Grant's writing is clear. There's great clarity in it. It's well written. It captures the style of his voice. But it was a book which almost did not come to fruition. And Mark Twain, one of the biggest and most important things in his life was that he did help Grant write this masterpiece of war and war writing. His memoirs. It began basically Grant and Twain had connected after the war and were friends. And in about 1881, Mark Twain began encouraging U.S. Grant to write his memoirs. And Grant was not that interested at the time. However, towards the end of his life in 1883-84, Grant lost all of his money, and his business partner lost his fortune.
An early Ponzi scheme, I guess is the way I've heard it described.
That is what it was, and Grant was penniless at the end of his life, and there was no such thing as a presidential pension at the time, and Grant was trying to figure out a way to care for his family. And in 1884, he had mentioned to a friend of Twain's that he was more serious about writing his memoirs. And Twain, when Twain heard that, he went to him immediately and worked out a deal where he could publish his memoirs. And the interesting thing was Twain had always resented publishers of that era who took advantage of authors. He was one of the pioneers fighting the issues of copyright, but he thought it was a tragedy that authors would write these books and get almost nothing, and their publishers would make all the money. So when Twain was financially able, he decided to become a publisher himself, and he created Charles L. Webster Company, which was his publisher.
Where'd that name come from, do you know?
His niece, Annie Moffett, had married a prominent New York businessman named Charles L. Webster. So it was actually the husband of his niece. And so it was within the family. Yeah. And Charles Webster considered himself a businessman, and Mark Twain considered himself a writer, and they thought the two of them would make a great pair. And in fact, their first two publications in 1884, the first publication of Charles L. Webster and Company was Huckleberry Finn.
Not a bad choice.
Not a bad choice. And their second publication was the Memoirs of U.S. Grant. So this publishing house, if you look at the first two things it published, it was headed for greatness.
Yeah.
And certainly
they could have stopped there and they would have been in the history books.
It almost didn't happen when Mark Twain was trying to work out a deal with U.S. Grant. Grant felt like that their friendship was so much that he did not want to take advantage of Mark Twain. But Mark Twain told him Grant had hoped that he might be able to make $25,000 off of his memoirs for his family before he died, and he had just been diagnosed with cancer, throat cancer, and the entire period he was writing the book, he was fighting death and sensing his mortality. And they said he wrote the last several chapters of the book unable to speak due to the progression of the cancer. But Mark Twain physically was there with him throughout all this period, encouraged him to write. While he was writing, he frequently compared his memoirs to Caesar's commentaries, and which of course Grant liked. But Grant had originally been offered $500 by a magazine publisher. It was unbelievable how little he was being offered. And Mark Twain wrote him a check for $25,000, although Grant wouldn't cash it until they had finalized the deal. He wrote him a check for $25,000 on the first day. The book ended up selling over 300,000 copies. And the deal that Mark Twain and Grant had worked out was that after the printing costs, that Grant would get 70% and the publishing house would get 30%. And within several months of its publication, Charles L. Webster Company wrote Mrs. Grant, after Grant had died, a check for $200,000. It was the largest, printing royalty check that an author had ever received, and off the book, within the first couple of years, the Grant family was paid over $500,000, which was a magnificent, unheard of amount for an author of a book.
And he didn't live to see any of that. He didn't know how it had turned out because he died really before the book actually came out.
He died in the summer of 1885, and they began trying to sell the book in the fall of 1885, and they basically got it out by Christmas time. And so most of the books you'll see were from the winter of 1885, early 1886, and it was all sold by subscription. So the Charles L. Webster Publishing House was, and you, as a historian of the book business, know what a subscription book
what you're holding
was.
is a salesman sample, which is what the salesman would go out and show to the potential customers, and it's got the different bindings. I think that your copy has some of the different options that you know, if you didn't have much money, you'd get the cloth edition. Then there was a leather edition that was a little nicer, that smooth calf, and then there was the deluxe edition, which is gorgeous black leather. So there were a bunch of variations depending on how much you wanted to spend, and they become increasingly rare as you go.
And so basically, a salesman would come to your house and would say,
sort of like the old Bible salesman.
Mr. Smith, would you like the Morocco binding, or would you like the sheep binding, or would you like the cloth binding? And
most of what was sold was the cloth, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. You know, that would have been the standard one. Now this book, the salesman sample that you've got, you know, and it has just probably 60 pages of text scattered throughout the book, has some of the illustrations, so it's sort of a teaser to get you interested in the book. And back at the back are a bunch of blank pages where the salesman would fill in who was buying the book and what kind of copy. And yours is particularly interesting because
this actually was sold in an auction in 1911 from the library of Mark Twain. And in fact, several of these right here are from Mark Twain's own library, which you and I have enjoyed looking at and speculating about. But the interesting thing was, when I looked in this salesman's sample, sample book, it lists who subscribed to volumes, and this is actually Mark Twain's. This is whoever sold him his copies. He is listed in here, and if you look here, it says Samuel L. Clemens, Hartford. He got a Morocco. He also got a sheep. and he got a cloth, so he got one of each variation to be delivered. And then there's also Orrin Clemens, which is spelled like Orion, but it was pronounced Orrin Clemens, and it was care of SLC, and that's Mark Twain's brother. And so Mark Twain bought his brother a sheep version of Grant's memoirs.
So
and apparently it was this one is actually, has the stamp JLC, which is the initials of Mark Twain's daughter, Jean. And this was apparently a book in Mark Twain's library that she claimed.
Now, of those 3 copies that he bought, you have right here 2 of those copies.
Right. And sometimes Mark Twain, he had a habit of writing in his books and having what would be called marginalia. And Mark Twain as a reader has often been written about because he would have conversations with his books. And you can see how he's thinking, and they're wonderful if you ever see a copy of a book that Mark Twain really engaged with. He's written all over it, just written all over it. And these don't have a lot of writing, and and I don't know whether Mark Twain just showed them the respect, or but apparently
he was so involved in the publication, maybe he didn't need to do that. Could you show us? Does it have his signature in it, or?
Actually, what these have in them is a book plate from the sale. And it says, this volume is from the library of Samuel Langhorne Clemens from the sale of February 1911. And it's signed by Albert Bigelow Payne, who was his literary executor. But Mark Twain's name is not in any of these. Now, the one copy that I don't have was a Morocco edition that apparently was signed by Grant's wife after, and had a brief inscription to Mark Twain, and it does have, he did sign his name in it, but there's not any marginalia in his Grant books.
Now, when did these come up for sale originally? Was it
1911. And the copy that was signed by Grant's widow was sold in 1951 at an auction of his daughter Clara's library. So, I mean, if you talk to Mark Twain collectors, there's a 1911 sale, and then there's a 1951 sale. The 1911 sale was of Mark Twain's estate, and the 1951 was his daughter Clara. And at Clara's death, most of the remaining pieces of his literary estate went to the University of California at Berkeley.
Thanks for bringing these. They are spectacular, and I'm really excited to see it. And it certainly adds to the history of Ulysses S. Grant and finding out about Twain. So thank you very much for being here.